we've been talking about the culture wars that are going on in the defense or in the discretionary budget before the break, and I wanted to sort of maybe back up and talk a little bit about you've got the cultural conservatives, and then you have fiscal conservatives, and there's some overlap between the two. But from a purely fiscal perspective, when you look at the discretionary budget over the last, say, 10 years, we were spending a little over $1 trillion back in 2014. During the COVID pandemic, discretionary spending rose to almost $2 trillion. It was about $1.9 trillion. So the debt limit deal, where they set a cap on discretionary spending for next year of 2024, is about $1.6 trillion. So, from a fiscal perspective, is it appropriate to look at, where we were 10 years ago at $1 trillion and say, look, we've gone from $1 trillion to $1.6 trillion as our target? That looks like a pretty big increase. Alternatively, if you go back to the pandemic and say, well, we used to spend $2 trillion and we've got to squeeze that down to the 1.6. So, what's the better way to look at that? I mean, has spending really gotten out of hand and the 1.6 trillion is really more than generous? Or should you look at the 1.6 trillion and say, well, relative to what we were spending during the pandemic, that's really, starving the government. And so what's sort of the perception there among the members? And, is 1.6 really too much or really too little?
Yeah, well, that obviously depends on what party you're in, right? But I mean, it's true that discretionary spending really spiked during the pandemic because there was something like $5 trillion worth of aid they pumped up over the last couple of years there for the COVID-19 pandemic. So you did see a big spike in spending and in deficits, and then that aid, though, has now sort of run out, which is why Biden can take credit for a dramatic drop in the deficit, which is really just because a lot of that pandemic aid spending has run out. It's not because of any hard cuts they made. But I have to say, Steve, if you've talked to the Congressional Budget Office, discretionary spending just isn't the reason that we're facing these huge deficits in the future. It's almost beside the point. I mean, it's entitlement spending that's the reason for these huge deficits. They were projecting something like $20 trillion of deficits over the next decade, I think. Why? It's not really because of discretionary spending, which is basically flat or rising with inflation. It's entitlements. You've got an aging society. You've got rising healthcare costs. And those demographics mean you've got soaring costs in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And that's where all the big money is. And I think the reason you see the House conservatives laser focused on these discretionary spending battles is just because that's the easier battle to wage, because it's the money they directly control through annual appropriations. So if they want to make a mark as a fiscal conservative, they try to clamp down on the discretionary spending, which is only about a third of the federal budget anyway. But they want everyone to see them clamping down on discretionary spending, so it looks like they're going to, rein in overall spending and be tough. But unless you tackle the big entitlement programs, you're really not making that much of a dent in these huge projected structural deficits that we're facing in the next few decades.